Chères étudiantes et étudiants, chers collègues, c'est un grand plaisir de vous accueillir aujourd'hui, 14 mars 2025, pour accueillir le docteur Emma Macleod, que je vais présenter aussi brièvement que je peux en langue anglaise, puisque le séminaire aura lieu en anglais aujourd'hui. So it's both an honor and a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Emma Macleod. Emma is a visiting professor with us at Université Bordeaux Montaigne this month in March. She has offered and will be offering seminar courses and workshops for students at different stages of their studies. Emma and I have been long friends. We had the same supervisor at the University of Edinburgh a few years ago, so back in the time. So Emma teaches history at the Department of History and Politics at the University of Stirling in Scotland. So I'm not going to detail her distinguished CV, but let me just mention a few of her research activities, which could be perhaps some inspiration for us, if I may. Emma leads an interdisciplinary research group called the 18th Century Studies Group, which brings together scholars from her university, and they organize various activities such as workshops and writing retreats. It's something that we don't do, but I would rather fancy a writing retreat somewhere in the Périgord or along the Cap Ferret. Some colleagues have their addresses. That could be a nice thing to do, writing retreats. Emma has held senior editorial responsibilities for many years, especially at the Scottish Historical Review, which is the leading journal of Scottish history. She's just been elected president of the 18th Century Scottish Studies Society, of which I am a recent but proud and assertive member. An association that brings together a number of specialists from all specialties worldwide. Emma's range of scientific interests is broad. She's worked on British perceptions of France and the United States at the time of the Revolutionary Wars and in the early 19th century. Her first book, entitled A War of Ideas, British Attitudes to Wars Against Revolutionary France, 1792-1802, is a distinguished contribution to a field of studying British politics during the French Revolution. She's also authored British Visions of America, 1775-1820, bravely straddling the 18th and the 19th century, a book which examines the ways in which revolutionary America and later the young American Republic, the US, represented a model or not for the British. And one of the workshops will be devoted to the question of the US as a model or an anti-model. And this is, of course, not a political statement or allusion about what's happening today in the US. So currently, Emma is working in two collaborative international projects. A multi-volume critical edition of a manuscript correspondence between James Woodrow and Samuel Kenrick, a correspondence which spans several decades, including the revolutions in America and France, and so that's primary source, a testimony over British, French, and American politics. And secondly, and this is of particular interest for today, Emma's been working on the treason and sedition trials that took place in Scotland and elsewhere in the Anglophone world during the French Revolution and after. So today's conference is part of this second area of expertise. The title is slightly different from the one advertised Orbi at Orbi, but is still substantially on the same topic. Precedent, Enlightenment Justice and the Mind of Government in the British State Trials, 1793, 1799. The floor is yours, Emma. Thank you very much for being with us.
Do I need to hold that? Thank you so much for having me, Remy. Thank you for being so generous. Pascal, thank you for having me. Thank you to everybody for having me and for being so generous as to listen in English. We would not be here for long if I was speaking in French. So let me introduce you first to some of the people you can see on the screen. In May 1794, the British Home Secretary, Henry Dundas, who is the tall gentleman on your left, commissioned a report on the procedures followed during the Jacobite treason trials of the late 17th and early 18th centuries. Its author, John Bruce, who's the fellow lounging on your right, Fellow of the Royal Societies of Edinburgh, London and Göttingen, until 1792 Professor of Logic at the University of Edinburgh, later recollected the occasion of this report that he'd written for Henry Dundas in 1794. And he wrote this later. Mr. Pitt, the First Lord of the Treasury, or Prime Minister, and Mr. Dundas, who at this time was Secretary of State for the Home Department, having considered that both for internal and external defence, it would be safer to rest their measures upon the wisdom of former times than upon untried theories, employed Mr. Bruce, whose industry they had been for some years directing to Indian affairs, to collect precedents for them from the papers of state, such as might be applicable to the trials for the new species of sedition and rebellion which were arising from the introduction of French opinions. Political trials resulting in transportations and executions, as well as lesser sentences, were a pervasive element of the Age of Revolutions, as states reacted to critics deemed to be deviant and dangerous during this period of heightened political tension. So today what I want to do is to discuss the English and Scottish trials for treason and sedition in the 1790s, to try to understand something of the mind of government beyond a simple elite instinct for repression. And the state trials for treason and sedition in Scotland and England in the 1790s are often cited together, but they're most often actually studied completely separately, rather than compared or contrasted at any length. However, in 3 books published since 2005, the historian Bob Harris has pointed out that we have been paying too little attention to the complex web of connections between radical reformers in Scotland and England, which go far beyond the few kind of well-known links on the surface of 1790s history. I need to exempt distinguished exceptions to that rule, such as my good friend Rémy Dutilleux, who would never be so gauche and who knows very well the connections between the reformers. And then Malcolm Chase and Gordon Pentland have both demonstrated the upheavals of 1819 and 20 ought also to be treated as a pan-British phenomenon. So what I want to say is that on the other side of the coin, not just the side of the campaigners for political reform, at the level of government, we also ought to be looking for shared history. The English and Scottish government prosecutions of the reformers, I think, can't be fully understood separately for at least 4 reasons. There's the critical importance of chronology, which I'll get to, in the sequence of prosecutions across the 2 jurisdictions. Second, the government's keen interest in these Anglo-Scottish links between the reformers. Third, the government's Anglo-Scottish approach to prosecution, and crucially because of the centrality of this figure of the Home Secretary, who was also the government's manager of Scottish affairs, Henry Dundas. He was central to the trials in both England and Scotland. So I want to suggest this morning that taking an integrated Anglo-Scottish approach sheds further light on government motivation by looking at mutual influence and agency between the conduct of the trials on either side of the border. And John Bruce's 1794 report, which is really the main subject of examination today, on historical Anglo-Scottish treason trials, shows that the government of William Pitt the Younger, particularly in the person of Henry Dundas, was deeply interested in historical precedent and what could be learned or legitimised from it. And seminal works such as John Barrell's Imagining the King's Death, published in 2000, notwithstanding, I think it's still worth asking whether the uncovering and mourning of the dislocations of reformers wrought by a government under the constraints of policy making during the French Revolution and the ensuing wars might now usefully be rebalanced in further examining how and why the government felt itself to be so constrained and how it made its choices. Other scholars, such as Adam Zamoyski and Kenneth Johnson, have emphasised the ruin of reformers collectively and individually by a government in the grip of what Johnson called self-delusion. But as Clive Emsley pointed out, to blame the failure of the radicals and reformers in the 1790s wholly on repression and terror can prevent us not only from investigating the internal conflicts within the reform movement in detail, but also it prevents us from examining properly the nature of the repression itself if we simply say, well, it was all due to a wicked tyrannical government. How did the government of a state which, however aristocratic and illiberal it was, and it was both of those things, how did the government understand the need for public consent and legitimacy and see them as in some senses characteristic of the British Constitution and yet justify the exercise of such brutal political justice? To what extent should these trials be understood in the light of recent discussions of moderate or conservative enlightenment, or even the end of enlightenment? So John Barrell's Imagining the King's Death has gone furthest in integrating analysis of the trials in Scotland and England in the 1790s. It's principally concerned with the English trials for treason, but by examining the evolution of government policy over time, Barrell demonstrated the opportunities that the Pitt administration took to test various legal and political innovations in the Scottish treason trials of August-September 1793, August-September 1794, the treason trials in Scotland, before they were applied to the English treason trials in October through December that year. And if I were giving this talk in Scotland, there would be lots of eye rolling at this point because we often feel ourselves to be the test tube for British policy that's later ruled out in England. Methodologically, in 2006, Werner and Zimmermann proposed a method of comparative analysis termed histoire-croisée, which is concerned to go beyond the discernment of similarities and differences, so your standard compare and contrast, and rather to investigate the mutual influence and agency between the objects of a comparison. And while the shared characteristics and differences between the trials on either side of the border, this traditional compare and contrast, are interesting and instructive, and I've started doing some of that work elsewhere, if we consider this report by John Bruce in 1794 into Anglo-Scottish treason trials since the late 17th century, we can develop John Barrell's line of thought by examining how they influenced and acted on each other. And I think the mindset in government that's demonstrated by this evidence is important not only for understanding the critical period of the 1790s, but also for events in the decades beyond it, as the precedents laid down by the unusual cluster of prosecutions tried for treason and sedition provided a model followed until at least 1820. Okay, all of that by way of introduction, and you've been very patient. There's John Barrell again. So, Henry Dundas, Home Secretary from July 1791 till July 1794. He was in post through the two major periods of Scottish sedition trials, August-September 1793, January 1794, also in post through the seizure of leading political reformers in England in May 1794. And although he moved to become Secretary of State for War in July 1794, he remained centrally involved in the Privy Council pre-trial examinations of the prisoners in London through the early autumn, and he usually took the lead in questioning the prisoners, supported by other politicians, including Pitt himself and the law officers. At the same time, Henry Dundas continued to manage Scottish political affairs on Pitt's behalf through the rest of the decade, including the treason trials of Robert Watt and David Downey in August-September 1794. His nephew, who's the shorter chap here, Robert Dundas, with whom he worked very closely, was Lord Advocate in Scotland, Scotland's most senior legal officer. And more broadly, Henry Dundas continued to operate in the triumvirate right at the heart of government in Westminster, William Pitt himself and Pitt's cousin William Grenville, who was the Foreign Secretary. So he's a very powerful man. So that's Dundas. Here's John Bruce. He took up the post of Deputy Keeper of the State Paper Office in London in 1792, joining the Scottish diaspora in the British capital. He knew Dundas well already. He had been tutor to Dundas's son, also confusingly called Robert, and taken him on a European grand tour. But he was brought down to London to this position in the State Paper Office in July 1792 with the aim to utilise the archives under his charge in bringing the experience of the past to bear upon the problems of the present. And for a historian, that's a very interesting rationale. But here you are, evidence of his closeness to Henry Dundas for some time. And Bruce did indeed carry out various other substantial research projects for Dundas, but in his 1794 report on the Jacobite treason trials of up to 100 years previously, Bruce was clearly looking for models from the past in order to support and also to suggest the process to be followed in 1794. In the context of Dundas's employment of him, I think we can surmise that he was following instructions in taking this approach to his subject. So this is the science bit, if we're going to be L'Oreal about it. I'm going to start at the bottom of the dates here. On the 4th of June, he concluded writing the report that he'd begun writing on the 21st of May. The 21st of May is a mere 9 days after the first arrests were made in London of leading reformers, and only 6 days after the discovery of something called the Pike Plot in Edinburgh. The timing of his report, I think, wasn't coincidental. It related also to the demand made in the House of Commons by the leader of the parliamentary opposition, Charles James Fox, that precedents for the government's high-handed behaviour towards these reformers should be produced, following Pitt's motion to refer to the House of Commons to a committee of secrecy to examine the books and papers of the main radical societies, the London Corresponding Society and the Society for Constitutional Information. And Bruce wrote later, he thought it would be rashness, sorry, this is Fox, he thought it would be rashness to refer the papers to a secret committee unless precedents were first adduced upon which to ground such a measure. But actually this thought about the need for precedent had already occurred to ministers, in fact, and Bruce had submitted a very brief memo, a 9-page note on precedents to ministers on the 10th of May, enabling Pitt to answer Fox as if off the top of his head in Parliament by citing Christopher Lair's involvement in the Atterbury plot, one of the big Jacobite plots, 1722, in which the papers were sent sealed to the House and referred to a secret committee. So Bruce's report, his big report, written very quickly, between the 21st of May and, what was that, the 4th of June, it was written ostensibly to address 3 questions. First, to the circumstances by which treasonable practices and treason have been detected. Second, to the steps taken by the ministers of the king after they had the proofs of treasonable practices or treason, either partially or fully before them. And third, to the different ways in which either the king or his ministers communicated the danger to Parliament. And what I think is most fascinating, and you can see it on this slide, about Bruce's summaries of the trials of the Jacobites, from the prosecution of those involved in the Popish plot, so-called, in the 1670s, right through to the trial of Dr. Florence Hensey in 1758, is the marginal annotations that he makes in red ink to draw Dundas's attention to potentially useful precedents. The trials were examined chronologically in his report, but I'm going to examine them under 3 headings. Those tactics which were already being implemented by the Pitt administration, those which were put into practice after Bruce's report, and those which were never taken up. So some of the strategies that Bruce is pointing to are things that the government is already doing. But precedent is useful for legitimising current actions. So, for example, after the extract that he provided of the House of Lords resolution of the 24th of April 1723 to examine Christopher Lair and others for involvement in the Atterbury plot, Bruce explains the manuscript letters in the collection 1719 to 23 show the following chain of evidence. It's in black. On the right-hand side of your screen. This chain of evidence which had led to the inference of a plot to lay violent hands on the sacred person of His Majesty. That's over the page. The parallel with the work of the Committee of Secrecy in the House of Commons sitting at that time, piecing together a chain of evidence from the papers of the London Corresponding Society and the Society for Constitutional Information, was surely impossible to miss. But just to make sure, Bruce writes in red in the margin, note, the letters in this report bear a strong resemblance to the inferences of the Committee of the Commons and in the House last Friday, so that Mr. Dundas will find strong precedents in the case. Perhaps the most remarkable precedent identified by Bruce was the content of the letter of Lord Townshend to the Scottish Lord Justice Clerk in December 1715, pointing out the mode of arranging the evidence on the trials for treason and defining different treasonable offences. This arrangement of the rebels into classes, Bruce wrote, may perhaps under the present circumstances be of use in classing first the persons who've been guilty of promulgating seditious opinions, second, those who've been guilty of substituting a representation by delegates of clubs instead of Parliament, and I'm sure the resonances with national conventions here are coming to your minds. And third, those who've been fabricating and distributing arms for the purpose of resistance or joining the French in the event of an invasion. And while Pitt's government doesn't seem to have categorised its prisoners on the charge of high treason in this way, probably because it charged all of them with all 3 of those offences, it's striking that the same 3 questions spread of seditious ideas, the substitution of a national convention for parliament, and the taking up of arms were right at the heart of the government's case against them. And I think it may suggest that we need to be more careful before dismissing the Cabinet's rationale for repression of radical reformism as simply unreasonable. In other words, the question may be not so much whether they were right to fear an international conspiracy to overthrow the British government and the British political and social order, but whether or not they did fear it. Townsend's three different classes of political offence were exactly the three classes which caused the Scottish prosecutors and judges, the Privy Council, the Committee of the House of Commons on Secrecy, and the English prosecutors and judges such alarm in 1794. Many of Bruce's precedents concern not rationales, however, but tactics. Again, some of these had already been implemented by the Pitt administration. Examining the actions of the first Walpole administration in the wake of the 1715 rebellion, Bruce noted Secretary Methuen instructions to Lord Advocate Sir David Dalrymple for supplying any defect in the form of imprisonment by warrant of commitment for high treason on the 13th of July 1716. He commented that this may suggest the steps to be taken in case of any defect of form, and serve to show the manner in which those in custody, though without sufficient evidence, may be detained till the public peace be restored. In fact, the Pitt administration had already suspended the operation of the principle of habeas corpus. In other words, you can detain somebody without limit. On the 7th of May 1794, as they were getting ready to swoop on the London radicals, and they had also suspended the act anent wrongous imprisonment in Scotland at the same time. Similarly, Bruce pointed out the use made of letters relative to the Popish plot seized with the Jacobite diplomat Edward Coleman, 1678, and commented the letters in this collection so nearly resemble the present circumstances which must be under Mr. Dundas's notice that they merit perusal as they show the grounds of proceedings in Parliament and in the trials. Condemnation of MPs' behaviour, opposition MPs' behaviour in a time of crisis was hardly novel in the 1790s either. A letter in a collection from Robert Walpole again on the state of the Tories in 1721-2 describes the conduct of opposition in Parliament as having excited discontents in the people, tending to second the efforts of the invaders. And Bruce didn't seem to think it was necessary even to gloss this note. And in reading it, it's impossible not to have a dozen Gilray and Rowlandson and Cruikshank prints swimming into view, depicting Charles James Fox and his political friends as fifth columnists in the 1790s, beckoning the French invaders over to England. Bruce reported in 1716 the Duke of Douglas had been instructed by the Earl of Stanhope, the Home Secretary, to search for all arms or other warlike stores which they shall judge to be dangerous for the peace of the kingdom, or which are kept and used contrary to the terms of the preceding acts, and to issue a proclamation as Lord Lieutenant requiring such persons as have such arms to bring them in and deliver them up. He wondered again, underlining his words in red ink, might not the Lord's Lieutenant lately appointed in Scotland proceed on this account? This particular proposal was not implemented, but the search of Robert Watt's house in Edinburgh in 1794 had revealed the pikes which were supposedly intended to storm the bastions of power in Edinburgh. But in summer 1794, ministers repeatedly interrogated reformist prisoners regarding what they knew about knives and drilling, and searches for arms almost became frenzied in London and Sheffield and York. So all of these things that they were already doing, that Bruce's report into the Jacobites allows them to say, we have precedents for all of this. This is how one behaves when one's at risk of treasonable activity. Secondly, and more briefly, other tactics suggested to Bruce by his research into the attempts of King George I's governments to deal with Jacobite rebellions were implemented or developed more fully after his report was submitted on the 4th of June 1794 to George III's ministers, whether because of his report or simply after it. He observed that George I's administrations had passed a variety of acts for punishing and preventing rebellion. It appeared, he wrote, that a variety of acts passed for punishing and preventing rebellion proceeded upon the overt acts of rebellion, which at that time had taken place, but that in 1716 they were made the ground of steps taken by administration to check the seditious and rebellious spirit which at that time prevailed. And again, this note is not glossed, but presumably the inference was that on this precedent it was legitimate not only to punish overt rebellion, but also intent. Intent, that intangible quality whose evidence was so elusive but so necessary for suppressing the reform movement. James Epstein and David Carr have recently argued in their examination of what they call the Jacobin heart, so not the Jacobin heart, but the Jacobin heart in Britain, the deep intent of homegrown Republicans in the 1790s, that the dense interchange between plebeian radicals and government authority produced an arena in which reformers could not safely express the true ends at which they aimed, and in which therefore government must constantly search for evidence, overt acts which seemed to reveal those ends. John Barrell showed the change in the interpretation of the law of treason in 1794 to show the movement in the definition of the word imagine in the modern, weaker sense of simply to envisage from the 14th century statute, when the word imagine, imagining the king's death in the 14th century, was to plan it, to plot it, to work out how you were going to accomplish it. By the 1790s, imagine meant largely what we mean, which is simply to envisage it. That switch wasn't articulated in legal doctrine until the trial in Edinburgh of Robert Watt in 1794, as John Barrell shows. But actually, even as early as the trial for sedition of the three young printers, Morton, Alexander and Craig in Edinburgh, at Edinburgh Castle, they were drinking with the soldiers. Lord Henderland, in that case, was suggesting that even a loose damning of the king under the influence of alcohol should be taken literally as expressing a wish for the king's death and thereby his process down below. The Seditious Meetings Act of December 1795 and the legislation banning the existence of various societies, including the London Corresponding Society and the Society for Constitutional Information, by name in 1799, were foreshadowed by Bruce's note on legislation following the 45 rebellion, underlined in red ink. It is submitted to Mr. Dundas whether several of the preceding acts made against the episcopal meetings in Scotland are not grounds for an act to prohibit clubs or reform meetings and so on for seditious and rebellious purposes. The spirit of the repealed acts constitute a strong precedent. And then third, there were other policies yet flagged in this report by Bruce from his historical research, which were not employed by the Pitt administration in their efforts to suppress radical reformism. Give me a minute. But I think it's instructive to see that they were considered, whether or not they were taken seriously by anybody but Bruce. Perhaps the most sinister of Bruce's inspirations from the Jacobite period was the Act of Proscription of 1746, which, as Bruce said, was an act securing the Highlands, indemnifying judges, and requiring even school teachers and tutors of children to take the oath of allegiance. Ominously, he suggested, this precedent goes to a regulation for curbing the seditious in wearing of badges and indemnifying those who, from motives of loyalty, may be active in detecting them. But even the spirit of despotism didn't take the British government quite so far as to badge physically those it thought to be disloyal. How do we pull all this together then? There are only tantalising glimpses in the records of Bruce's relationship with Henry Dundas during this period and other government ministers and their responses to his papers, and little concrete evidence of the practical effects they might have had on government policy. So you will have gathered that I've been speculating. Dundas's immediate response was sometimes to tell Bruce to bind 50 copies for the members of the cabinet and my own particular friends. A few of Bruce's less sensitive reports were printed for limited circulation, those on the government of British India, the balance of power and trade in Europe, the history of the British repulsion of invasion attempts, political unions, for instance. So he did a report on the Union of 1707, which some of us were talking about on Wednesday morning, in advance of the Union of 1800 between Britain and Ireland. The Duke of Portland prefaced Bruce's review of the Union on Scotland, published in February 1799, with the explanation that he'd commissioned the paper for the purpose of learning from that precedent. Bruce's report on the history of British repulsion of invasion attempts was not surprisingly prefaced by a handwritten note addressed to cabinet ministers excuse me, by Dundas. The accompanying report, though printed for facilitating perusal, is not intended for publication. It's therefore requested that it may not be left open to common inspection, so don't leave your copy on the number 5 bus. There is no evidence, of course, that Bruce's report on historical treason trials was ever printed, not surprisingly, given the sensitive nature of his marginal notes. So it's clear that Dundas was interested to know what might be learned, what might be legitimised. It's arguable that however severe the British government's response was to the threat they perceived to emanate from radical reformers in the 1790s, they were concerned at least to achieve the manifestation of legality for their policies, and perhaps even with the reality of legality. Even if they were desperate to convict the Scottish martyrs in 1793-4, and Thomas Hardy, John Horne-Tooke and John Thelwall in London in autumn 1794, they wanted to do it properly and with the appearance of constitutionality. Right justice and truth are not necessarily suggested. What I'm suggesting is that the very act of commissioning such research into potential precedent may suggest a recognition of the importance of legal justification, and that there was perhaps an instinct to secure it in ministers of a state who saw that state in having historic and even foundational values of concern for the rule of law and public consent. So, just in a final section, trying to think about the mindset of ministers, not only in the context of the revolution in France, but also in the framework of intellectual currents which have variously been described as moderate enlightenment, conservative enlightenment, and even end of enlightenment, before we put the two back together again. So in 1989, John Pocock wrote an essay questioning the assumption that enlightenment was necessarily a radical liberation of the mind from traditions of oppression, arguing that some of the effects of enlightenment were to strengthen existing elites in their capacity for civil control. So he's saying that conservative enlightenment thinkers were less trying to bring about emancipation from tradition, or previous modes of social power, and more seeking protection from autocracy, religious fanaticism, and civil war. British clergymen, philosophers and lawyers were invested in ending an age of enthusiasm and disorder by means of ideas, as much as the philosophes in France were intent on overthrowing the political and social order by the same means. More recently, Jonathan Israel has proposed that thinkers such as Adam Ferguson in Scotland and Anne-Robert Turgot here use the new sciences of economics, ethnology and social science to forge new ways of conceiving and legitimating class hierarchy and obedience. They resisted political and social change that was not absolutely essential, as likely to disrupt and endanger society. They accepted the need for religion, and they preferred marginal, piecemeal amelioration to the sweeping revolutionary transformation of what Jonathan Israel calls the radical Enlightenment. But that's not to admit that they weren't enlightened in their rejection of despotism, superstition, and intolerance. Rather, they believed that this moderate Enlightenment offered genuine political and social benefits to mankind. And one of the things that happened in 1799, he says, is that an unparalleled strand of counter-Enlightenment dragged the moderate Enlightenment opinion in its wake forthrightly to the right into a rigid, ossifying, anti-democratic moderatism. So these moderate Enlightenment writers tended to see the American and French revolutions as quite different in nature, while radical Enlightenment writers saw them as similar. But that is not to say that all those who resisted or repressed radical Enlightenment aspirations were not influenced themselves by or even active in Enlightenment. In other words, some enlightened thinkers and those they influenced argued for restrictions on civil and political liberty, as well as did those who were completely opposed to Enlightenment altogether. So my question in my context here is, how far was the thinking of British government ministers, policymakers and legal officers influenced by their operating in a public square populated by a spectrum of Enlightenment ideas? They dealt in practice with the outworkings of radical Enlightenment principles in the form of political reform societies and their activities. They dealt with those radical ideas by means of more conservative ideas, which nonetheless had produced substantial shifts in terms of sociology, political economy, and religion. Moreover, a commitment to a belief in historic British values of concern for the rule of law and public consent might be compatible with conservatism by the end of the 18th century, but it doesn't suggest despotism. William Pitt was sent by his father, the Earl of Chatham, not to Tory Anglican Oxford University, but to Whiggish latitudinarian Cambridge, where his reading, his biographer John Ehrman tells us, sufficed with little addition as a basis for the rest of his life, which doesn't speak well of Pitt's cultural interests, but if anything, it increases the significance of what he was reading as a teenager. Locke's political philosophy, Robertson's history, Hume's moral philosophy, alongside the ancient Greek and Roman historians, Renaissance dramatists and poets, as well as mathematics and science. These were not outweighed by the Tory Clarendon, Bolingbroke, Burnet, Johnson and Gibbon texts on the Cambridge curriculum as well, because of the Whig emphasis. And the text which most famously influenced him, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, suits Israel's definition of moderate enlightenment neatly, and it was published when Pitt was an impressionable 17 years old. Richard Whatmore's end of Enlightenment thesis is valuable here, especially in the light of the polarisation of political culture in Britain in the 1790s. He argues that the Enlightenment project of reshaping society towards toleration and peace and away from superstition and war, caused by religious fanaticism, by means of reason, was believed even by its proponents, from David Hume and Adam Smith onwards, to have failed by the end of the 18th century, as the world was swept instead not by religious fanaticism, but by political fanaticism, terror, conspiracies and violence. The Earl of Shelburne, key influence on Pitt as a young man, was convinced that the times were moving back towards the fanaticism and chaos of the 17th century. And I'm just going to wrap up fairly swiftly here. What's particularly interesting in this context is Whatmore's suggestion was that it wasn't only those we might describe as radical or democratic Enlightenment writers, the great optimists of the age, who believed that the enterprise has failed, but also more moderate proponents of Enlightenment, such as Edmund Burke. And I think that's worth examining as we think about government ministers and legal officers in the state trials of the 1790s and how they justified, even to themselves, the illiberalism of their actions. It's worth remembering that Bruce's report wasn't published, even if ministers drew on it in his other work occasionally to answer questions in the House of Commons. They weren't then commissioned as direct propaganda, nor were they used extensively in Parliament. In the quote that I started with, in his recollections in 1800, he explained that Pitt and Dundas considered that it would be safer to rest their measures on the wisdom of former times than on untried theories. That is code for French revolutionary ideas in the minds of conservative British thinkers, abstractions and theories. That they had employed him to collect precedents for them from the papers of state, such as might be applicable to the trials for the new species of sedition and rebellion, which were arising from the introduction of French opinions. And while there was appalling brutality, protection of self-interest, failure to understand the British movement for radical reform at work in ministers' thinking regarding the prosecutions for treason in the 1790s, I think it may also have been the case that ministers' instinct, even in a time of deep political crisis, was to recognise the importance of legal justification. Thank you for your patience.